President Trump says he is leaving the hospital this evening as the coronavirus continues to spread throughout the White House and the Republican Party. He announced the news on Twitter this afternoon, writing, quote, "Feeling very good. Don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your life. We have developed under the Trump administration some really great drugs and knowledge. I feel better than I did 20 years ago," end quote. Outside Walter Reed Medical Center earlier, President Trump's doctors said despite his improving condition, some risk still remains. White House physician Sean Conley seemed ready to dispense positive information about the president's condition, but he would not answer key questions about potential damage from the virus.
Can you tell us when he had his last negative test? Was it Thursday? Was it Wednesday? Do you remember when he had his last negative test?
I don't want to go backwards.
Pneumonia or any inflammation in his lungs at all?
So we've done routine standard imaging. I'm just not at liberty to discuss.
Doctor, so you're actively not telling us what those lung scans showed, just to be clear.
So there are HIPAA rules and regulations that restrict me in sharing certain things for his safety and his own health and reasons.
Any abnormal tests? Were any of his lab tests abnormal?
I'm not. Again, HIPAA kind of precludes me from going into too much depth and things that I'm not at liberty or doesn't wish to be discussed. At some future point, maybe, but today, sorry.
Questions have already been raised about the information the medical team is giving to the public after the president's doctor admitted to concealing information about whether President Trump was given oxygen, a move he said was done in order to project a positive message. Now, White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany is the latest top staffer to test positive for COVID-19. Two of her aides tested positive Monday as well. Despite her repeated direct exposure to those infected with the virus, McEnany chose not to quarantine, nor did she wear a mask when speaking with reporters Sunday. A number of people in the president's orbit who attended a Rose Garden ceremony for Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett 9 days ago have tested positive. It is worth noting, even though the main event for Judge Barrett was held outdoors, several of those seated in the front two rows also attended receptions indoors, where the CDC says transmission is more likely. President Trump was last seen in public Sunday evening. Two Secret Service agents drove Mr. Trump in a hermetically sealed car past supporters, raising concerns about the agents' exposure. The White House claims they volunteered, and the movement was cleared by a medical team as safe. Here's how the president described his experience in the hospital in a video that appears to be taped right before this ride.
We're getting great reports from the doctors. This is an incredible hospital, Walter Reed. It's been a very interesting journey. I learned a lot about COVID. I learned it by really going to school. This is the real school. This isn't the let's read the book school. And I get it, and I understand it, and it's a very interesting thing, and I'm going to be letting you know about it. In the meantime, we love the USA, and we love what's happening.
The ever-important question of who knew what and when is growing more significant. The president traveled to New Jersey for a 200-person fundraiser Thursday after learning top aide Hope Hicks had tested positive. Here's how the state's Democratic governor described the fallout to CBS This Morning.
A group of folks from out of state coming in knowingly having been exposed to someone who's COVID positive is really, really frustrating. It's complicated. We started the contact tracing immediately. We ultimately got a list of the attendees by mid-afternoon on Friday. By the way, it's a group of folks who are nationally based, not just in New Jersey. We've got staff members of the club that we're contact tracing with here. We've done everything, and we continue to do everything we can. We need more out of the federal side of this, but it's extreme.
Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden is campaigning in Florida after his third negative test since Friday. He spent 90 minutes 12 feet away from President Trump at last week's debate. New CDC guidance acknowledges that under some conditions, people farther than 6 feet can be infected with the virus via airborne transmission. The former VP has largely refrained from weighing in on the president's condition.
My prayers continue to be with the President and the First Lady for their health and safety. as they, like so many American families, are dealing with COVID-19. I was glad to see the president speaking and recording videos over the weekend. Now that he's busy tweeting campaign messages, I would ask him to do this. Listen to the scientists. Support masks. Support a mask mandates nationwide.
Let's bring in Ed O'Keefe and Eugene Scott. Ed is a CBS News political correspondent, and Eugene is a political reporter for The Washington Post. Welcome to you both. A lot to sort through. Ed, let's start with you and begin with the president's tweet announcing his discharge, where he wrote, quote, "Don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your life." And we now know the Trump campaign says the president does plan to participate in next week's debate. So politically, Ed, what message is the president trying to send? How does it contrast with what we've heard from Joe Biden?
Right. The statement from his campaign spokesman is that it's, quote, the president's intention to debate. That is not firm, of course. That suggests that, you know, there could be changes there. Other aides have been out and about today saying that the president will take cues from his doctors as to whether or not he can engage. And look, October 15th might as well be 3 years from now, based on what's transpired over the last 3 days. So we'll see about all that. But the president does say he's headed home tonight, 6:30 Eastern time from Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Stunning turn of events, and one that has a lot of people scratching their head. They don't quite understand how a guy who apparently only got sick at some point last week, although the timeline you laid out there reminds us that it may have been sooner than we were told, can somehow go home. Of course, the difference is that the president has the best medical care in the world, and there is an ICU in the White House complex should something happen to him, God forbid, while he's back at the residence. The other question will be, where exactly is he headed once he gets there? Will he go up to the 3rd floor and quarantine in the private residence? Or will he somehow at some point make his way to the West Wing? And if he does, who's with him? Who's allowed to be around him? What do they have to do potentially to protect themselves? And what does that mean for everyone else who works in that part of the White House complex, should he decide to take that step? This is really incredible, and you know, the word careless has been used by many, and I think in this case, to some extent, given the pronouncements by medical experts, government experts that work for the president down the line, you know, he seems to be flouting all of those recommendations. And that tweet, don't be afraid of COVID, don't let it dominate your life, that's the message he's been trying to send, essentially, from the campaign pulpit for the last several months, because they know that every time COVID is the topic of conversation, the president suffers. So clearly, not only is he eager to go home, but his campaign is probably eager to change the subject back to other things that somehow would help his numbers.
Right. Well, those statements by the president really stand in sharp contrast to the facts that show millions of Americans have been infected, and more than 200,000 people in the United States have died because of COVID-19. Eugene, let me turn to you. So your paper, The Washington Post, reported that the president and his team made the decision to send him to Walter Reed preemptively Friday, while he was still able to walk to the helicopter on his own. On top of that, the Wall Street Journal reports President Trump told an advisor not to discuss their own positive tests, saying, quote, "Don't tell anyone." What does this tell us about the president's priorities when it comes to responding to this virus?
Well, it doesn't seem like his main priority right now has been transparency. It's certainly worth noting that most of what we know about the president's condition, and even the initial diagnosis, it's not because he was so transparent. It's because journalists did the work and found out that our president and other staff members at the White House had been infected. One of the reasons the president perhaps may have not been as open about this, in addition to how much he's downplayed COVID and has continued to, we saw as recently as today, is that part of his appeal to his base has been that he's the strong man who's tough and who can take all types of blows, even physical, that come his way. But the reality is coronavirus is a very serious situation, especially for someone in his age demographic and some of his other demographics that could make him disproportionately more likely to suffer from an infection, which is why we saw that shortly after he was hospitalized, he was given a steroid for people usually who have serious infections related to coronavirus. And so I can imagine that this is not a message the president, who has campaigned repeatedly on being strong and powerful and being able to take on the tough guys, wants people who have to vote in a few weeks to learn. But the reality is, just like has been the case for much of this administration, journalists have gotten to the bottom of this and likely will continue to do so.
You know, Ed, I want to ask you about how Joe Biden is navigating through all of this, because, of course, he was very critical, repeatedly so, ahead of President Trump's diagnosis about the way in which the Trump administration and the president himself has handled this pandemic. What's been the challenge for Biden here moving forward as we look ahead to the debates and the campaign trail in these final weeks here before the election?
Well, there was a decision last Friday that was announced just around the time the helicopter was landing at the White House that the Biden campaign would be pulling its negative advertising about the president off the air. There are some pretty sharp attack ads out there by the Biden campaign themselves about the president's leadership of the pandemic specifically. They said that those ads would be pulled off. We got some evidence over the weekend that some were still running, but a lot of that could actually be in the eye of the beholder. Either way, Biden advertising overall continues, and he's spending tens of millions of dollars on it in about a dozen battleground states in different ways. So you'll still see him on the air. We've also been reminded Democratic super PACs did not commit to pulling their attack ads, so viewers may still be seeing those in some parts of the country. But as you saw in that clip you played a little while ago, he's not necessarily holding back. He's expressing warm thoughts and sympathies and prayers for the first family, but then turns around and reminds them, look, you know, you have not been handling this well, at least in his view, and the president needs to do better. And Biden claims he would do better were he elected president. Virtually every day, Biden talks or tweets about the president's handling of this pandemic. They know it's a winner for them. They know it's working. And so he's going to continue to do that. Whether he has to be gentle about it or more forceful remains to be seen. But I think the kind of way that Biden did it there in the clip we played a little while ago is a sign that he's not necessarily planning on holding back. They see no need to. And they are probably getting a read on it through the polling that they do pretty aggressively at the Biden campaign, that there's a sense across the country that the president is dropping the ball yet again, now in this case, in terms of his own personal health. And there was a moment today as he left his home state of Delaware to go, this is him arriving in Florida, but when he was leaving Delaware earlier today, he was talking to reporters, as he often does at the beginning of a travel day, and was getting a little close to them. And at one point, Jill Biden came over and essentially pulled him back away from the reporters, trying to remind her husband to check his natural instinct to get close to people and say, step back. You're supposed to keep your distance. And he said, oh, sorry, and continued answering the question. So you can see the visual contrast is so stark between what the Biden campaign does on a daily basis when he's out and about and what the Trump campaign does. And, you know, we'll see ultimately if it works, not only from a political standpoint, but in keeping the candidate healthy.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear, Ed, about trying to sort of curb that natural human instinct to have a conversation with someone and you want to get close to be able to talk to them. But obviously, in the midst of this pandemic, you see folks are very mindful. It sounds like Jill Biden very mindful of keeping that social distance. Eugene, the New York Times is reporting that some members of the White House housekeeping department have tested positive for COVID-19, along with other staffers working closely with the president. How do people who work in the White House, both inside and outside the administration, feel about how this is being handled? What are you hearing about that?
There's been some frustration from these staffers who have said that they haven't gotten any clear communication about contact tracing or other advice from their superiors about how best to respond to what appears to be a bit of an outbreak in the White House. There also has been reporting that some of these staffers may have been cautioned to be discreet and discerning in terms of how public they are about how unsafe their workplace environment is. And this has been a great concern of many people, specifically public health experts, who've been keeping their eyes on this pandemic for quite some time. We know that many of the individuals who are disproportionately more likely to be affected and to die from coronavirus happen to be people of color and low-income people and working class people who don't always have access to health care, certainly not Walter Reed, in their neighborhoods, and also very often have some of the illnesses and diseases that can complicate a coronavirus infection. And very, very often, these are the type of individuals who are more likely to have some of the service jobs that we are talking about, that we are seeing among White House staffers, such as the housekeepers. And so there's been some quite a bit of interest and reflection on the difference in between what the president and some of his top aides have been able to experience in terms of health care and what these other individuals that we're speaking of have experienced.
Well, Ed, Vice President Mike Pence is traveling to Utah today ahead of Wednesday's debate with Senator Kamala Harris. How much do the events of the last few days raise the stakes for that debate?
Off the screen, I would think. You know, this has suddenly become what is usually the backwater affair in these scheduled debates to arguably the most critical exchange, because you have millions of Americans across the country not that familiar with Vice President Pence, even after 4 years, and probably many more less familiar with Kamala Harris, given that she's only a more recent addition to the national political stage. And, you know, the Vice President's 61, the Senator's 55. They would potentially have to step in for men in their 70s who both have checkered pasts, at least in their health. They have checkered medical pasts. So, you know, it's, I think, takes on much greater importance. And hopefully the questions will be about, you know, the conversations you may have had with your principal about when or if you should step in, whether you would ever consider taking steps with the cabinet on your own to potentially invoke the 25th Amendment, or if there ever have been such conversations, what qualifies you to step in at a moment's notice if need be, and are you ready to do so? And then let's discuss the domestic and foreign policy issues that a vice president might have to quickly consider. How would they handle the COVID crisis? How would they deal with foreign adversaries? Because, you know, given where we are right now, it's a possibility that that would have to happen.
Right. Typically, candidates are reticent to answer hypotheticals, but in the midst of what has happened now, you can imagine that millions of Americans are going to be very interested to find out what the answers to those potential hypothetical situations might be. All right, Ed O'Keefe and Eugene Scott, thank you both very much.